I think I didn't do anything wrong, just smiled when his boss's hand slipped too low at dinner. But the next morning, my credit cards were cut off, and hours later, I saw an envelope waiting on the kitchen table. That was when I realized Thomas wasn't sulking anymore. He was moving forward. Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible stories. The evening started with polished silverware, candlelight, and a table filled with people I barely knew but wanted to impress. It was Thomas's corporate dinner, an event meant to showcase loyalty, camaraderie, and support for his company. I told myself it was boring, but still, I enjoyed the chance to dress in something elegant, wear my best heels, and be seen. When his boss, Victor Harland, entered the room, the air shifted. He had the kind of presence that demanded attention, tall, confident, his voice carrying over the chatter like he owned the space. Thomas introduced me, and as Victor leaned closer, his hand rested a little too low on my back. I froze for a moment, aware of where his fingers lingered, then smiled brightly. Instead of brushing it off, I let myself enjoy the little thrill of power, knowing Thomas noticed. I even leaned in slightly, laughing at Victor's story. I thought of it as harmless fun, nothing more than a moment of charm. But the glance Thomas gave me was sharp, almost wounded, as if something had broken between us, right there at the dinner table. On the ride home, the silence was heavy. I tried to break it with casual comments about how nice the food had been, how Victor had such a commanding presence, how maybe Thomas should learn from him. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. I accused him of sulking, of being embarrassed in front of his colleagues. He muttered only one sentence, that I hadn't needed to smile like that. I scoffed, told him he was being ridiculous, that it was just good manners. I framed it as his insecurity, insisting he was paranoid. By the time we pulled into the driveway, I had convinced myself I'd won. The next morning, though, everything shifted. I went to buy coffee on my way to work, sliding my card through the reader, and it declined. I tried another. Declined. Confused, I called the bank. They told me the accounts were temporarily frozen, requested by my husband. My heart skipped, first in disbelief, then in rage. How dare he cut off my access without warning? I stormed back home, demanding an explanation. Thomas was at the kitchen table, calmly eating toast. When I asked him about the cards, he looked up briefly and said he thought it was time to separate responsibilities. His calm tone infuriated me. I accused him of punishing me for smiling at his boss, of acting like a dictator. He didn't argue. He simply said finances were serious, and it was better to handle them properly. I shouted that he was trying to control me. He stood, gathered his papers, and left for work without raising his voice once. I vented to my friend Naomi later that day. She laughed nervously when I told her about Victor's hand, saying maybe I had gone too far by smiling. I dismissed her concern, saying Thomas was old-fashioned, stuck in a world where women couldn't enjoy attention. Naomi reminded me that perception mattered, that men didn't forget humiliation. I told her she was being dramatic, but her words lingered. When I returned home that evening, Thomas's study door was locked. It hadn't been locked before. That simple turn of the key sent a jolt of unease through me. What was he hiding in there? At dinner, the children sensed the tension. Isabel asked why Daddy wasn't talking much. I laughed, telling her Daddy was just tired from work. Erin tried to tell a joke, but no one laughed, and the silence grew thicker. After the kids went to bed, I confronted Thomas again, accusing him of trying to freeze me out, both emotionally and financially. He said only that trust mattered, and when it broke, things had to be rebuilt carefully. I rolled my eyes, calling him melodramatic, but inside, something churned. The following weekend, Margaret came to visit. She doted on the children, asking about school, and then pulled me aside. She said she'd heard about the dinner and thought I was reckless. I bristled, asking who told her. She said Thomas didn't need to tell her. She could see it in his face. Margaret's sharp gaze made me feel small, and I lashed back, saying she always interfered. She didn't flinch, only muttered that Thomas deserved better than humiliation in public. I slammed the cupboard door after she left, furious at how quickly the family seemed to circle around him. Determined not to lose ground, I invited Naomi over for drinks. I retold the story, embellishing it, making it sound like Thomas had been jealous of nothing. Naomi laughed politely but shifted uncomfortably. She asked if I was sure I hadn't meant more by the smile. I waved her off, saying men read into things too much. But Naomi didn't defend me the way she usually did, and I noticed. The walls around me felt like they were inching closer. The next morning, I tried my cards again. Still declined. My anger boiled. I stormed into Thomas's study, rattling the doorknob, but it was locked as always. Later, when I confronted him in the kitchen, I demanded my access back. He calmly said finances would now be monitored for the children's needs first. I screamed that he was cutting me out of my own life, trying to control everything. He didn't raise his voice, didn't defend himself. He simply said my actions had consequences, and then he walked away. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering how everything had slipped so quickly. I told myself Thomas was bluffing, that he was trying to scare me into apologizing. But a small, unsettling thought whispered that maybe he wasn't bluffing at all. Maybe he had already begun building something against me. The first cracks in my certainty had appeared, and though I still told myself I was justified, the silence of Thomas's strategy gnawed at me. For the first time, I felt the faint edge of fear, because he was no longer arguing, no longer pleading. He was planning. The following days were marked by a strange rhythm. Quiet mornings, strained evenings, and the steady feeling that something was being constructed around me while I wasn't paying attention. Thomas no longer argued or snapped when I threw barbs his way. Instead, he moved with calm determination, almost like a man executing a plan step by step. His refusal to fight back made me feel unmoored, because in the past, at least when we argued, I knew the boundaries. Now the silence was suffocating. I tried to act as though nothing had changed. I spent hours at the mall, pretending the declined cards hadn't embarrassed me, using a spare one I kept for emergencies. But even that limit was low, and the sting of being forced to explain myself to clerks was unbearable. I called Naomi to complain, saying Thomas was cutting me off financially to punish me. She asked if I had considered sitting down and actually apologizing. I scoffed, saying apologizing would make me look guilty when all I did was smile politely at his boss. Naomi reminded me that perception mattered more than intent. I snapped that she was turning into Margaret, always rushing to Thomas's defense. She sighed and warned me not to underestimate him. I brushed her off, but a part of me replayed her words in the back of my mind long after the call ended. At home, I began noticing more unsettling details. The study door remained locked, and when I passed by, I sometimes heard faint shuffling of papers or the muted sound of a phone call. Thomas would come out composed, greeting Isabel and Aaron warmly, asking about school, helping with homework while barely acknowledging me. The children gravitated toward him more than ever. Isabel asked him to check her math problems instead of me, and Aaron begged him for bedtime stories. Their preference stung. I told myself Thomas was turning them against me, but deep down, I wondered if they were simply responding to his steady presence. One evening, during dinner, I tried to stir conversation. I laughed loudly about a story from work, deliberately tossing in a line about how Victor, the boss, had complimented my blouse when I saw him in the office lobby. Thomas looked up briefly, his expression neutral, then returned to cutting Aaron's chicken. That indifference enraged me more than anger ever could. I lashed out, saying he was sulking because he couldn't handle another man noticing me. He didn't bite. He simply told Isabel to finish her vegetables and excused himself from the table. Isabel looked at me nervously, as if waiting for me to explode, and Aaron slid off his chair to follow his father. I sat alone at the table, furious, feeling both ignored and irrelevant. Margaret dropped by the next day, under the pretense of bringing cookies for the children. She stayed long enough to observe Thomas quietly balancing bills at the table while the kids colored beside him. She pulled me aside in the hallway, whispering that she hoped I understood what I was risking. I snapped that she should mind her own business. She fixed me with a sharp look and said Thomas was stronger than I thought. Her confidence in him unsettled me, because for once she wasn't scolding, she was warning. That night, after everyone went to bed, I poured myself a drink and paced the kitchen. I tried the study door again, pressing my ear to the wood. Nothing. I rattled the knob, but it didn't budge. I imagined piles of evidence stacked neatly inside, proof of every careless word I'd ever spoken. I told myself it was ridiculous, but the unease grew. A few days later, Naomi came by after work. We sat in the living room while the children played upstairs. She leaned in and told me bluntly that Thomas had reached out to her, asking for copies of our text conversations. My blood ran cold. Naomi admitted she had already given him what he asked for. She said she couldn't lie for me anymore. I shouted that she was betraying me, siding with him against her own friend. Naomi shook her head and said Thomas had a right to the truth. She reminded me of the messages where I'd bragged about making him look small, about how Victor found me more charming than Thomas ever could. My face burned as she recited them. I insisted they were jokes, exaggerations, harmless venting. Naomi looked at me with pity, not belief. She left soon after, and I sat trembling on the couch, realizing my own words were now weapons against me. Later that night, Thomas came into the kitchen where I was sitting in the dark. He placed a sealed envelope on the table and told me it was important. I tore it open, my hand shaking. Inside were copies of those very conversations, highlighted sections where I had mocked him, belittled him, laughed about the way Victor's attention made Thomas uncomfortable. Seeing my words laid out in cold print filled me with dread. I tried to laugh it off, waving the papers and saying they were meaningless, just private jokes between friends. Thomas didn't argue. He said quietly that intentions revealed themselves in words, and words had consequences. Then he left me sitting there, my laughter sounding hollow even to my own ears. The children sensed the shift the next day. Isabel avoided me, sitting closer to her father on the couch. Aaron asked if Daddy would always stay with them, the question laced with fear. I forced a smile and told him, of course, but Thomas looked at me with an expression that said the opposite. I felt the ground slipping beneath me, though I tried to convince myself I was still in control. The tension deepened when Margaret invited us to dinner again. Around the table, she spoke pointedly about loyalty and respect. I laughed too loudly, insisting marriages were about humor and not taking things so seriously. She snapped that humiliation wasn't humor, and Thomas simply stayed quiet, sipping his water. Isabel stared at her plate, cheeks red, while Aaron clutched his fork tightly. I stormed out before dessert, humiliated by their disapproval. Back home, I confronted Thomas, shouting that he was turning everyone against me, poisoning even Naomi and Margaret. He remained calm, saying he hadn't twisted anything. He'd only shown them what I had written myself. That calm voice was worse than rage. It was final. That night, lying in bed, I realized the power balance had shifted completely. I had once believed my words and laughter could control the narrative, but now my own voice had become the evidence against me. Thomas's silence wasn't weakness, it was strength. And though I refused to admit it out loud, a creeping fear settled over me that he had already won. The cliffhanger tightened around me like a noose. If Naomi had already surrendered the texts, what else did Thomas have waiting behind that locked study door? The third week after the dinner felt like a slow unraveling of the world I thought I controlled. Every day, Thomas grew more distant, not in the sulking way I had once accused him of, but in a deliberate, measured manner. He stopped reacting to my taunts. When I joked about Victor again, tossing his name into casual conversation to see if I could get a rise out of Thomas, he didn't so much as blink. Instead, he focused on the children, asking Isabel about her violin practice and Aaron about his science project. They laughed and answered eagerly, leaving me sitting there like an outsider at my own table. That indifference ate at me far worse than anger ever could. I told myself he was playing a game, trying to make me sweat. To prove I wasn't rattled, I decided to make a statement at Margaret's next family dinner. I dressed in my boldest outfit, determined to remind everyone that I was still the center of attention. From the moment we walked into Margaret's home, though, I knew the ground had shifted. She greeted Thomas warmly, hugging him tight, while giving me only a curt nod. At the dinner table, conversation flowed easily between Thomas and his sister, with the children laughing along. Every time I spoke, the room grew slightly colder, as if my presence carried a weight no one wanted to acknowledge. I tried to reassert myself by recounting the restaurant incident, twisting it into a joke about how men overreact when women are simply being polite. I forced laughter, hoping others would join. Margaret cut in sharply, saying humiliation wasn't politeness and respect wasn't optional. Thomas didn't defend me. He didn't even look up. He simply took another sip of water and focused on cutting Aaron's meat. Isabel sat stiffly, staring down at her plate. The silence that followed Margaret's remark made me flush with anger. I accused her of meddling, of trying to turn Thomas against me. She shot back that Thomas didn't need any help to see the truth. The drive home was unbearable. I spoke rapidly, trying to twist the dinner into proof that Margaret had always hated me, that she was poisoning the family. Thomas didn't respond. His silence was so complete, it felt like a wall I couldn't break. The children sat quietly in the back seat, sensing the tension. I felt like I was screaming into a void, unheard and irrelevant. The following day, Naomi came over, hesitant, her face pale. She admitted Thomas had approached her again, asking more questions, seeking clarification on certain messages. She confessed that she had given him everything, including our most private chats, where I mocked his insecurities and bragged about how Victor enjoyed my attention. My chest tightened as she said it. I accused her of betrayal, of siding with him because she was jealous of me. Naomi didn't flinch. She said she was tired of covering for me, tired of pretending my behavior was harmless. She said children shouldn't grow up in a home where their father was constantly humiliated. Her pity infuriated me. I threw her out, slamming the door behind her, but her words lingered like a poison I couldn't shake. That evening, Thomas handed me another envelope. I tore it open with trembling hands. Inside were printed transcripts of those very conversations Naomi had described, with highlighted lines where I'd written that Thomas was boring, too serious, and that Victor was more of a man than he'd ever be. Seeing my own words in cold print made my stomach twist. I tried to laugh it off, waving the papers and saying they were just harmless, venting between friends. Thomas didn't argue. He said calmly that intentions revealed themselves in words, and that words mattered. His composure made me feel smaller than ever before. The children reacted to the tension in subtle but piercing ways. Isabel stopped coming to me for help with homework. She waited for Thomas instead. Aaron clung to his father during bedtime, refusing to let me read him a story. When I asked why, he said softly that Daddy read better. My chest burned at the rejection. I accused Thomas of turning them against me. He replied evenly that children saw more than adults realized. The truth in his words cut deeper than any shout. One night, desperate to claw back some control, I decided to corner Thomas. I dressed carefully and brought up Victor again, saying casually that he had invited me to another work function. I wanted to see some flicker of jealousy. Thomas looked at me for a long moment, then said I could do as I pleased. His voice was calm, but the weight behind it left me shaken. He wasn't jealous. He wasn't angry. He was finished. At Margaret's next visit, the divide became undeniable. She hugged the children and praised Thomas for holding the family together during a difficult time. She didn't speak to me directly. Isabel whispered to her aunt that she didn't like it when Mommy laughed at Daddy. The words hit me like a stone. I tried to dismiss them, saying children misunderstood things, but Margaret gave me a look that said she knew exactly what was happening. That night, Thomas's study door remained locked, but I couldn't stop staring at it. I imagined folders stacked high, every word, every action catalogued, and waiting to be used against me. I rattled the doorknob again, but it didn't budge. In my frustration, I shouted that he was hiding things, plotting behind my back. From the other room, Thomas answered calmly, "I'm preparing." The simplicity of that statement froze me. Preparing for what? The next morning, an envelope appeared on the kitchen table. My name was written on it in Thomas's neat handwriting. Inside were copies of my bank statements, highlighting purchases I'd made after the cards had been cut off. He had tracked even the emergency card I thought he didn't know about. Attached was a note in his handwriting. "This is why accounts must be separated. Actions have consequences." My hands shook as I read it. I tried to dismiss it as petty bookkeeping, but deep down I knew it was more than that. It was evidence. It was a step in whatever quiet plan he was building. I spent the rest of the day pacing the house, telling myself he was bluffing, that he wouldn't dare follow through on whatever scheme he thought he had. But that night, as I lay in bed, I heard the faint creak of his study door opening and closing. He was still working late, still preparing, and for the first time, the thought entered my mind that Thomas was no longer trying to save the marriage at all. He was preparing to dismantle it, piece by piece, with precision I had never imagined he possessed. The cliffhanger was undeniable now. Thomas had evidence, allies, and patience, and I was beginning to realize that my laughter and justifications had already become the rope tightening around my own neck. The fourth stage of this unraveling began on a grey Saturday morning, when the air in the house felt colder than usual, despite the heat humming through the vents. Thomas had started leaving earlier and coming back later, always with that same folder tucked under his arm. I used to think he was simply carrying work documents, but now I knew better. Each time the lock clicked on the study door, I felt as if another brick was being laid in the wall he was building around me. I hated that sense of exclusion, the feeling that decisions were being made in silence while I was left pacing outside like a stranger in my own home. I decided to strike back in my own way, to prove I still had control over how people saw us. That evening, when Thomas mentioned he had to stop by the office to pick up some files, I insisted on coming along. He raised an eyebrow but said nothing, and we drove together in silence. At the office lobby, we happened to run into Victor. He smiled broadly, his gaze lingering on me a second too long. I leaned forward slightly, returning the smile, deliberately letting Thomas see. My aim was simple, to show him that I still had power, that people noticed me. Victor asked Thomas about a recent project and then complimented me on my dress. I laughed, making the moment bigger than it was, but Thomas's face remained calm, unreadable. That composure rattled me. On the way home, I mocked Thomas, saying he was so paranoid he couldn't handle a harmless compliment. He kept his eyes on the road, saying quietly that insecurity was not the problem. Respect was. His tone chilled me, because it wasn't angry, it was final, as though the conversation had already been judged and filed away. I tried to gaslight him, saying he was imagining things, twisting harmless smiles into betrayal. He didn't respond. He simply pulled into the driveway, gathered his folder, and went inside. The children began to notice the shifts more openly now. Isabel asked me if Daddy still loved me. I forced a laugh, telling her of course he did, that sometimes grown-ups just argued. But she looked doubtful, her little face serious beyond her years. Aaron, meanwhile, clung closer to Thomas, asking him to help build Lego sets late into the evening. When I tried to join in, Aaron turned his back and said he wanted Daddy instead. The sting of rejection burned deep, and I lashed out at Thomas later, accusing him of poisoning the children against me. He replied evenly that children only needed to see the truth to understand. That calm response cut more deeply than shouting ever could. Margaret invited us for Sunday dinner again, and though I wanted to refuse, Thomas insisted we should go. At the table, Margaret praised Thomas for his dedication to the children, speaking pointedly about loyalty and commitment. I tried to interject, making a sarcastic joke about how Thomas spent more time with his folders than with me. No one laughed. Isabel looked down. Aaron whispered something to his aunt, and Thomas remained silent. Margaret seized the moment, saying sometimes silence was a man's strength, especially when he was building something important. My chest tightened at her words. She knew, or at least she suspected. I accused her of meddling once more, but she only gave me a steady, knowing stare. That night, I confronted Thomas again, shouting that Margaret was feeding him lies, that he was letting others dictate our marriage. He didn't shout back. Instead, he walked to the kitchen table, pulled out another envelope, and slid it toward me. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside were bank statements highlighting not only my emergency card spending, but also text records Naomi had surrendered. He had everything, my mocking remarks, my boasts, even receipts for the nights I claimed to be working late, but was really out with Naomi drinking. I tried to twist it, saying Naomi had betrayed me, that she was jealous of me. Thomas only said that friends revealed their loyalty in truth, not in lies. His voice was steady, and I felt the fight drain out of me. Desperate to regain footing, I reached out to Victor myself, arranging a casual coffee under the pretense of discussing Thomas's work project. I thought maybe if Victor sided with me, I could use it as leverage. But when I hinted about Thomas being too serious and insecure, Victor frowned. He said Thomas was one of the most reliable men he knew, and that I was playing a dangerous game. His words stung because I realized even Victor, the man whose hand had sparked all this, wasn't willing to shield me. When I returned home, Thomas was in the study again, door locked. I stood outside, listening to the faint sound of papers rustling, the low murmur of a phone call. My mind raced with possibilities. Was he speaking to a lawyer, arranging custody, planning financial shifts? The fear twisted into anger. I banged on the door, demanding he open it. He called back through the wood that there was nothing left to discuss until the right time came. His calm voice made me want to scream. That evening, Isabel asked me if I was mad at Daddy. I forced a smile, saying of course not, but she looked at me with wide, suspicious eyes. Aaron avoided me altogether, following Thomas around the house like a shadow. I felt my own children slipping further and further from me, and every attempt I made to charm or joke only seemed to push them closer to him. Finally, one night, Thomas sat me down at the kitchen table. He placed a thick envelope in front of me, his expression unreadable. He told me it was official now. My stomach clenched as I opened it and saw the stamped divorce papers, neatly arranged, with highlighted sections showing custody requests and financial protections. I gasped, demanding to know how he could do this, accusing him of plotting behind my back with Margaret and Naomi. He replied calmly that he hadn't plotted at all. He had simply gathered the truth and let it speak for itself. I shouted that no judge would ever believe him over me, that I could spin the story in court. He didn't flinch. He said facts spoke louder than laughter, and then he walked away, leaving me alone at the table with the papers spread out before me. My hands trembled as I tried to convince myself he was bluffing, that this was some elaborate scare tactic. But the weight of the documents told me otherwise. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling, listening to the creak of the study door as Thomas worked late again. His silence was no longer something I could mock. It was a weapon. And I realized, with a growing knot of dread, that he wasn't preparing to fight me anymore. He was preparing to end me, quietly, legally, and with a precision I had never thought him capable of. The cliffhanger was brutal. The papers were real, the silence unshakable, and the children already choosing his side. And I was left with nothing but the echo of my own justifications, which sounded hollower with every passing day. The fifth stage of the story arrived not with shouting or slammed doors, but with a knock at the front entrance that echoed like a final verdict. I was in the living room, half-heartedly scrolling through my phone, when Thomas opened the door and accepted a thick envelope from a man in a grey suit. The air changed instantly, heavy with a weight I couldn't name. Thomas didn't even glance at me. He simply placed the envelope on the dining table and walked upstairs to fetch something. My hand shook as I reached for it, ripping the seal before I could stop myself. Inside were legal papers, stamped and bound, the unmistakable language of lawyers filling each page. Divorce, custody, financial separation. The words blurred as my pulse raced. I felt as though the walls themselves were closing in. I stumbled into the kitchen, clutching the papers, and confronted Thomas when he came back downstairs. I shouted that he had blindsided me, that no decent man would betray his wife like this. He looked at me evenly and said betrayal was already the cornerstone of our marriage, and he was simply choosing to end it in a way that protected the children. I tried to turn it on him, accusing him of destroying our family, but his calmness unnerved me. He said the family had been destroyed long ago. With every lie, every laugh at his expense, every night I chose others over him. His words felt like knives, not because they were cruel, but because they were delivered without rage, stripped bare of emotion. My instinct was to call Naomi, to vent, to demand her support, but when I rang her, she hesitated before answering. Her voice was strained, distant, and when I explained what Thomas had done, she told me perhaps it was time I looked in the mirror. I hung up in fury, convinced she had turned against me as well. I told myself Thomas had manipulated her somehow, poisoned everyone against me. The truth, though, whispered at the edge of my mind, people were simply tired of my games. That evening, Margaret arrived. She didn't ring the doorbell. Thomas had clearly invited her. She sat at the table with him, while the children lingered nearby, listening. Margaret spoke calmly, outlining how stability was more important than comfort, how children thrived in predictable homes rather than chaotic ones. I interrupted, shouting that she was meddling again, that she was orchestrating everything. But when I turned to the children, hoping for sympathy, their faces told me otherwise. Isabel looked sad, but nodded slightly when Margaret spoke of safe homes. Aaron avoided my gaze altogether, his small shoulders hunched as if he wanted to vanish. I realized, with a sick twist of dread, that they believed her more than they believed me. The following days blurred together, each one bringing another step in Thomas's quiet march toward freedom. He met with lawyers, visited the bank, and adjusted accounts. I overheard him on the phone discussing joint custody and financial disclosures. Each overheard detail felt like a hammer blow. I accused him of trying to ruin me financially, but he corrected me. He said he was only protecting himself and the children, that my own spending and recklessness had made this necessary. I tried to twist his words, painting him as greedy, but he simply walked away, leaving me to stew in my own bitterness. In a desperate move, I contacted Victor, believing perhaps he could at least vouch for me, maybe even sway Thomas by reminding him of my charm. We met for coffee, and I tried to spin the story, painting Thomas as controlling and cold. Victor listened, but then he leaned forward and told me Thomas was doing the right thing. He said any man in his position would have acted sooner. My throat went dry. Even Victor, the spark of this entire downfall, had no sympathy left for me. When I returned home, Thomas was waiting. He didn't ask where I had been. He didn't need to. He slid another envelope across the table, this one containing witness statements, text transcripts, and timelines of my lies. He told me he didn't need to raise his voice because the evidence spoke louder than I ever could. I tried to laugh it off, to tell him no judge would care about a few flirty smiles or half-truths. but my laughter rang hollow, echoing through the kitchen like broken glass. The children, once my fallback, drifted further from me. Isabel began refusing to sleep in my room, choosing instead to curl up with Thomas and Aaron in the den while they watched movies. Aaron stopped speaking to me altogether, only answering Thomas's gentle questions. I told myself it was brainwashing, manipulation, but deep down I knew better. They had simply chosen the parent who gave them stability. The more I scrambled, the more they recoiled. Margaret's presence grew stronger. She accompanied Thomas to meetings, helped him with the children, and even began cooking dinners at the house. I mocked her openly, calling her a vulture, circling a broken marriage. She didn't flinch. Instead, she looked at me with a pity that burned worse than scorn. She said I had already lost the fight when I laughed at my husband in public. Those words echoed through me long after she left. One night, Thomas sat me down again. He explained the process clearly. Custody would be joint, but the children would reside primarily with him. Financial accounts were already secured, debts allocated fairly. I shouted that he couldn't just erase me, that I was their mother, that no paper could change that. He looked at me, steady and calm, and said being a mother required more than a title. It required actions. His words gutted me, not because they were cruel, but because they rang with a truth I could no longer spin. The cliffhanger of the stage came as he handed me the official court date. The paper trembled in my hands as he explained that everything was already set in motion. Lawyers, banks, and judges now stood between us. It was no longer about my laughter, my justifications, or my manipulations. The machinery of the law had begun to move, slow but unstoppable, and I was trapped beneath its grinding wheels. As he walked away, I sat frozen at the table, the court date burning into my mind. My games had finally run out of players, and Thomas no longer needed to speak. His silence had become the loudest voice in the room, and it told me everything. The end was not just near, it was already written. The final act of this unraveling came with the court date circled in red on the calendar, a reminder I could not avoid, no matter how hard I tried to distract myself. The morning of the hearing, the house was quiet, unnervingly so. Thomas moved with deliberate calm, helping Isabel with her shoes, making sure Aaron had his jacket, all while I tried to keep my composure. I told myself he was still bluffing, that no judge would take him seriously, that my role as the mother gave me the advantage. Yet my hands trembled as I packed a folder of half-prepared notes and receipts that meant nothing compared to the binders Thomas carried. His quiet confidence unsettled me more than shouting ever could. At the courthouse, the weight of reality hit me. The building was cold, lined with polished stone that seemed to echo my every step. Thomas walked a few paces ahead with Margaret at his side, while I trailed behind, furious at her intrusion. I whispered to myself that she was the true villain here, that she had orchestrated everything, but deep down I knew she was only an accessory to Thomas's newfound resolve. Inside the courtroom, his lawyer greeted him warmly, sliding a stack of documents onto the table. My own attorney arrived late, flustered, already asking for clarifications about the case. My stomach sank. When the proceedings began, Thomas's side spoke with precision, outlining months of instability, highlighting financial irresponsibility, and emphasizing the children's need for structure. They presented text logs where I mocked Thomas to friends, statements from Naomi describing my dismissive attitude, and even transcripts of Victor's reluctant admissions. Each piece of evidence stacked higher until I felt buried beneath it. I whispered angrily to my lawyer, demanding he object, insisting they were twisting everything, but my words carried no weight. The judge listened calmly, taking notes, while Thomas sat quietly, hands folded, speaking only when necessary. His silence was the loudest thing in the room, a contrast to my scattered protests. I tried to defend myself by claiming Thomas was cold, unromantic, that my behavior was nothing more than harmless jokes and coping mechanisms. But the judge's eyes sharpened when I admitted laughing at my husband in front of others. He asked if I understood the impact such behavior could have on the children's perception of their father. My words faltered. For the first time, I realized the courtroom wasn't concerned with my excuses. It was concerned with facts, actions, and consequences. The children's voices were heard through reports written by a child psychologist who had spoken with them privately. Isabel described feeling safer with her father, explaining that she didn't like when I turned everything into a game. Aaron admitted he often avoided me because he didn't know when I was being serious. Reading those words, I felt my chest tighten. I wanted to scream that Thomas had poisoned them, but the truth was undeniable. My own behavior had shaped their opinions. The psychologist's report recommended primary custody for Thomas, with structured visitation for me. It was a dagger I hadn't expected, and the blade twisted deeper with every page. Margaret's testimony came next, measured and composed. She explained how she had witnessed my dismissiveness, how I often escalated tensions, how Thomas had stepped back rather than retaliate. Her words were calm, not malicious, and that made them more damaging. I glared at her, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she glanced toward the children, as if to remind the court of their importance above my pride. The judge's ruling came faster than I anticipated. Primary custody to Thomas, financial accounts secured under joint oversight, but largely controlled by him, and structured visitation for me, every other weekend, with the possibility of re-evaluation after 6 months. Credit accounts I had once relied on were transferred, leaving me with only a modest allowance until the divorce was finalized. I felt stripped, reduced, humiliated, but outwardly, I forced a brittle smile, pretending this was temporary, pretending I still held power. Inside, though, I knew the tide had turned beyond my reach. Back at the house, the atmosphere was unrecognizable. Thomas moved about with quiet certainty, packing some of my belongings into labeled boxes for the visitation schedule. The children followed him naturally, asking him about dinner plans and school projects while barely acknowledging me. I snapped at Isabel for ignoring me, and she looked at me with eyes that carried more disappointment than anger. Aaron wouldn't even meet my gaze. For years I had believed I controlled the narrative, that I could spin anything to my advantage. Now even my children saw through me. I tried one last tactic that evening, cornering Thomas in the living room. I told him this was cruelty disguised as justice, that he was breaking apart a family we had built together. He replied softly that the family had broken when I chose ridicule over respect, when I valued attention from others over stability at home. He said the court's decision wasn't punishment, it was protection. His words cut deeper than any insult because they carried no malice. They were simply true. Margaret lingered near the door, not intervening, just observing. I wanted to scream at her, to accuse her of stealing my life, but I realized she didn't need to lift a finger. My own choices had already done the work. She wasn't the villain I had painted her to be. She was merely the witness to my collapse. The following week, I began the visitation schedule. The house felt hollow when I arrived to pick up the children, their bags neatly packed, their faces polite but distant. Isabel asked if we could just go to the park quietly, without games. Aaron held Thomas's hand until the very last moment before letting go. My protests, my justifications, my attempts at charm, none of it mattered anymore. Their loyalty had shifted, and it was not coming back. That night, I sat alone in a small apartment Thomas had helped arrange as part of the agreement. The silence was suffocating. I scrolled through old messages, replayed arguments in my mind, tried to convince myself this was unfair, yet the truth gnawed at me. I had laughed, I had mocked, I had dismissed him until he became a ghost in his own marriage. And when the time came, he didn't raise his voice, he simply raised the evidence. The final image seared into my mind was Thomas at the doorway, steady and calm, Isabel leaning into his side, Erin gripping his hand, Margaret watching from nearby. He didn't gloat, didn't smirk, didn't even look at me as if I mattered anymore. His silence was total, but it was filled with dignity. In that silence, I realized I had lost more than a husband. I had lost the very ground beneath me, and there was no narrative left to spin. The story ended, not with fireworks or a dramatic betrayal, but with papers signed, custody arranged, and a man regaining control of his life through the quiet, unshakable strength I had mistaken for weakness. My last weapon, my voice, sounded empty against the finality of the law. And in that emptiness, I was left only with myself, the very person I had spent years avoiding. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next story. Write in the comments from which city you are watching.